The first major conflict in the age of imperialism, outside the boundaries of North America at least, was the Spanish American War. That's not to say that this is the first act of imperializing that the United States did, it's just the first major conflict. Before this, the United States claimed over 100 Pacific islands under the Guano Islands Act and bought Alaska in 1867. And before that, obviously, the federal government used massacres, disease, and treaties to dispossess Native Americans of millions of acres of tribal land within the boundaries of the continental United States. So by the time 1898 rolls around, we're actually quite adept to imperialism, both in the sense of military intervention and legal finagling. The real issue at the turn of the century for the United States is that progressive idealism brings about this battle between those that would have the U.S. be the country who would live its best life and the country that would stick to fundamental ideals. Or, in other words, the country that will finally join the rest of the Western world in using industrial resources to conquer and take what's rightfully theirs to take, or a nation that espouses ideas of liberty and justice for all, even less developed countries. And at this point in time, both of these voices are equally loud and tend to have substantial power and influence. The beauty of the issue with Spain for our imperialist and anti-imperialists is that the crumbling Spanish Empire gives them both the chance to be right, and is a rare sight in American politics when both sides get to claim equal victory without trampling over each other. So at this point, Spain has colonies all over the planet, like most European powers, honestly, but they're losing it a bit. So if you look at our cartoon here, the Spanish crown is having problems, in particular with Cuba and the Philippine Islands, because in both of these areas they're facing nationalist uprisings, because surprisingly, those colonies don't particularly love being under the constant domination of a government that lives the world away and doesn't represent their ideas. Who would have guessed? And as we can see here, Spain's handling of the situation isn't great. They send in tons of troops to Cuba in particular to put down this uprising, but aren't super successful. And then the American press has a field day with this. I mean, what better to sell newspapers and magazines than the story of a group of ragtag nationalists fighting an oppressive government to win over the independence of their nation? We love that story. Now, this turns really bad fast for our Cuban nationals, though, because the Spanish take the people of Cuba and start putting them into concentration camps. General Weyler, who's in charge of this policy, attempted to justify the policy by saying he was putting Cuban citizens into these reconcentration centers to keep them safe from supposed insurgents so that the Spanish military would know who was loyal to Spain and who wasn't, and therefore presumably not kill them. But bad conditions in the concentration camps and things like starvation and disease led to over a third of the people dying. And so, of course, supporters of the Cuban national rebels in the United States deepened their support even further and called for the U.S. to do something about this. Immediately, the U.S. government doesn't do anything. After all, our foreign policy stance when it comes to other people's conflicts has solidly been isolationism. So what's going on in Cuba is certainly not good, and Congress can issue things like strongly worded messages to Spain about it, or maybe issue economic sanctions, but they're not going to declare war over it. But the press is relentless. We call this specific form of press yellow journalism. Men like William Randolph Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer ran newspapers that capitalized on spreading sensationalized headlines that were 100% intended to get strong reactions from people. This isn't to say that these were always false headlines, but they were usually wildly exaggerated in order to make people specifically mad or upset or curious. Usually, the newspaper editors would take something with a kernel of truth and then spin it in order to get more readers, more attention, or more scandal. Today, we see this all the time in internet-based media and clickbait articles. And just like in modern times, these articles are often debunked through the fact-checking of actual responsible journalists, but by that time, the story has usually done its damage and often taken on a life of its own, either as urban legend or perhaps today a supposedly fact-based meme. This kind of journalism contributed to the start of the Spanish-American War in a roundabout way by stirring the general public in favor of conflict with Spain. Both sides, imperialists and anti-imperialists, saw the atrocities committed against Cuban nationals and committed to action against it. Whether this was for the express purpose of becoming a better world power or being a beacon of democracy for the Cuban nationals really didn't matter. The second driving force behind U.S. involvement in the conflict was the Delaune Letter. In February of 1898, a letter from Dupuy de Lome, the Spanish ambassador to the U.S., to the Spanish foreign minister was discovered as part of a seized goods interception on a ship. In this letter, de Lome describes President McKinley as, quote, weak and a bitter for the admiration of the crowd, besides being a would-be politician who tries to leave a door open behind himself while keeping on good terms with his party, end quote. So, in other words, he's calling McKinley a coward, saying essentially that Spain has nothing to worry about when it comes to the U.S. getting involved in their conflict because McKinley doesn't have the guts to. Now, this is really pretty insulting to McKinley, who, as the executive of the United States, is also the head of the state and the person in charge of dealing with foreign affairs and diplomatic exchanges. But McKinley also knows that politicians be like this. So he's also not about to go to war over being insulted in what was a personal correspondence, because that would also be petty. I mean, after all, if you think about it, our founding fathers used to say worse things about each other in the open press. But the American public doesn't see it this way. They see this not only as an attack on McKinley, but as an attack on the United States and the nation's character as a whole. Even within his own executive branch, the Assistant Secretary of the Navy, Theodore Roosevelt, criticized the president as having, quote, the backbone of a chocolate eclair in response to this. And if you've never had a chocolate eclair, they're filled with cream. But in 1898, the public opinion isn't what pushes the United States into war. The theory of isolationism that we stick to as our doctrine of foreign policy says that we don't just jump into wars unless we're attacked or provoked directly. And this doesn't happen until the sinking of the USS Maine. Now, the circumstances of this are a bit unclear, but the general understanding today is that the Maine explosion was likely caused by an internal explosion, potentially from a soldier lighting up a cigarette where he wasn't supposed to. But at the time, our ship accidentally blowing up in Havana Harbor looked awfully suspicious, and the yellow journalism press wasn't about to just wait around for an actual investigation to finish, or start even, really, before jumping to blame the Spanish. And so if you look at our cartoon here on the right, we have what's probably the most obvious political cartoon we'll see all year. In the middle is a monster, which is labeled Spain on his belt, and he's holding a bloody knife, and in his other hand is a tombstone that reads, Maine soldiers murdered by Spain. So if you didn't get who killed them just by reading his belt and seeing the knife, they'll tell you there too. And then in the background, we've also got our soldiers dead on the ground, presumably also by Spain, here, who is also stepping on the American flag for extra measure. So this is all the justification that Congress really needs, apparently, and on April 25th, 1898, they declare war on Spain. Once the U.S. enters the war, the military is fighting on two fronts, because we're fighting Spain in both Cuba and the Philippines. So let's talk about them separately. Here's what things look like in the Caribbean. What we've got is the U.S. Navy creating a blockade around Cuba so the Spanish can't get supplies in or out, and then invading after departing from the port in Tampa, Florida. In all, the war lasts less than 4 months. On the ground, U.S. forces were made up of several groups. One of these groups was the Rough Riders, led by Teddy Roosevelt. Now, Roosevelt used to be Assistant Secretary of the Navy under McKinley, but when McKinley wavered on the idea of getting involved in the war, Roosevelt took his own money, which he had plenty of, really, and outfitted a group of dudes to go fight in Cuba as a cavalry unit. So to be clear, this is not the Army. This is an unofficial, unaffiliated military group fighting as uninvited freedom fighters in Cuba with Teddy Roosevelt's personal money. Now, when the U.S. does get involved in the war officially, the Rough Riders get absorbed into official military ranks. But until then, they're an independent group. And the thing that they're really best known for is the Battle of San Juan Hill, which was one of the last and really bloodiest battles of the war. Roosevelt and his guys need to rush the Spanish by charging up this hill, which tactically is always kind of a bad idea because then the enemy forces have full sight of you, but you're having to expend all of your energy charging the hill and can't really shoot back at them. So you're spending literally all your energy just trying to not get shot. And so this is incredibly dangerous and 99% of the time only ever done as a last resort. So Roosevelt is charge, and they all go running up this hill. Ultimately, they're successful in taking the hill, which is what leads to the ultimate defeat of the Spanish, and turns Roosevelt into essentially an instantaneous war hero. He was the man willing to speak out against McKinley and risk his own position in the cabinet, and he was the one willing to spend his own money to fight in the war even before the US wanted to. And he was the one willing to die charging up this hill with his men. So after this war is over, we do what we do with all politically inclined war heroes: we make him president. But Roosevelt doesn't deserve all the glory here. The Spanish-American War also saw the formation of the 9th and 10th Cavalry Buffalo Soldiers, which were the Army's segregated African-American unit who served alongside the Rough Riders and who also fought at the Battle of San Juan Hill. Despite being forced to serve under an ex-Confederate general, Joseph Wheeler, the 9th and 10th Cavalry formed strong bonds with the Rough Riders that they served alongside and received praise from Roosevelt after the war. 5 received the Congressional Medal of Honor for their service in Cuba. The success of black troops and their critical role in battles like San Juan Hill also sort of awkwardly underscored problems with race in the war itself, though, far and above their own service. When the United States got involved in Cuba, it did so under assumptions of liberation and backing a growing independence movement. So the logical sort of conclusion to that was that Cuba would be independent. But then when the US actually got to Cuba, they sort of, I guess, forgot that a massive part of the people they were going to be helping were black. Like, Cuba was a sugar planting island that until the 1880s still had legal slavery. As of the 1840s, about a third of the island's overall population was black. And so the US government completes the mission of freeing Cuba from Spanish rule, but then they're faced with really conflicting ideals. On the one hand, they know that independence is the correct way to handle this situation. After all, it was literally the whole point of getting involved here. But then on the other hand, white Americans at this point 100% do not think that minority populations are capable of self-government. Even a lot of what we'd consider more of the progressive minds of the time still subscribe to ideas of scientific racism and social Darwinism. And so very quickly, we start to see the federal government backpedaling in a way that our Buffalo Soldiers would have been super familiar with on their promises. So what the U.S. comes up with in terms of how to handle affairs with Cuba is a sort of quasi-independence. This is essentially the beginnings of dollar diplomacy or gunboat diplomacy, if you will, or at least the foundations of the idea behind it. It actually is essentially 2 steps. Step 1 is the Teller Amendment, which is a treaty. The Teller Amendment is the U.S. promising that we are not going to annex Cuba as a colony or a state, so that's off the table. The U.S. fought this entire war for Cuban independence, so that's how it's going to stay. Step 2 is the Platt Amendment a few years later, which is actually added to a joint resolution in Congress. Because to be fair, the Teller Amendment says we're not going to do or what we're not going to do, but not what we are going to do. Because again, the U.S. doesn't believe in just letting them run things unregulated. So what the Platt Amendment says, very boiled down here, is that 1, the United States can intervene in Cuban affairs if and when we think that's necessary. And 2, the U.S. is going to lease a Navy base at Guantanamo Bay. This is super convenient because that way, if we ever need to invade because they're messing things up, in our not so humble opinion, we'll have a place to invade from, which is obviously extremely paternalistic, but this is how we ultimately settle the Cuba question. So let's flip over to the other side of the planet, the Philippines. Because remember, Spain is also losing their grip on their colonial holdings there because of another nationalist movement. This one is actually over super quick because essentially Commodore Dewey shows up with a navy in Manila and the Spanish give up after a few hours. So in terms of defeating the Spanish, this was ridiculously simple. So when all is said and done, after we've defeated Spain in both the Cuban arena and the Philippines, we sit down and sign the Treaty of Paris. Super critically, this is signed by a whole room of white dudes like you see here in a photo on the left. None of the very nationals from either Cuba or the Philippines, who were literally the entire reason we got into this whole thing, were invited. So as one can imagine, that caused problems down the road. We'll get there in just a second. But for now, the white dudes in our photo here agreed that Cuba would be totally free from Spanish rule and that Spain would give up Puerto Rico and Guam as United States colonies. They also sold the Philippines to the U.S. for $20 million. No word at that point on what we would do with the Philippines yet. That would be a whole thing with our imperialists and anti-imperialists. But even more than this, the smaller details that we sometimes don't realize because they're not giant sexy islands with large governments today is that the United States also gained from this over 7,000 other islands as territories and colonies that collectively held about 8.5 million people. These are people who were at the mercy of American bureaucracy and economics and laws, but who had no representation themselves in the very system that controlled much of their lives. So essentially the very thing that Cuba and the Philippines literally just fought to escape. The nationalist movement in the Philippines continued strong after the United States took over as the new colonial oppressor. When the U.S. refused to acknowledge or include Filipino nationals in the negotiations of the Treaty of Paris or over their subsequent purchase of the Philippines, the Filipinos took action into their own hands by forming their own government and trying to continue on the path of independence anyway. In January 1899, they created the Philippine Republic with a formal constitution and Emilio Aguinaldo as president, but the U.S. refused to acknowledge its legitimacy. By the start of the next month, the new country declared war on the U.S. in the wake of the violence against its people, the Philippine-American War. The cartoon on the slide here is a really great representation of the relationship between the Philippines and the U.S. at this point. Here we see Uncle Sam attempting to save Emilio Aguinaldo from the water, but when he does so, he's attacked. The symbolism here is really important also. Aguinaldo is portrayed as a child, which is really clear as an indication of paternalism. In a lot of cartoons dating all the way back to the early 19th century, we see women and people of color portrayed as children to display the ways that white people, men in particular, either felt that they needed to be treated like children or in an effort to show their innocence and childlike features like ignorance. And so portraying Emilio Aguinaldo as a child here, even if he's a threatening child, is important to this tradition. And of course, the more Uncle Sam tries to help Aguinaldo, the more he's going to sink into these waters and the more danger he'll find himself in. At this point, he's really in a no-win scenario unless he tosses Aguinaldo aside and swims to shore himself. That's the cartoonist message. If Aguinaldo doesn't want to be rescued from the waters, let him be. This message was pretty solidly in line with our anti-imperialists of the time. By 1899, they were pretty laser-focused on being against American annexation of and involvement in the Philippines, with vocal leaders like Mark Twain, Andrew Carnegie, and William Jennings Bryan. In all of their messaging, the American Anti-Imperialist League ties the situation in the Philippines to clear rhetoric of freedom. Often, this looks like tying the cause of the Filipinos to that of the United States during our own independence movement in the 18th century. In this quote here, Carnegie is acknowledging some of the concerns that imperialists have brought up, which is that perhaps the Filipinos aren't ready to handle forming a new government. But he reminds readers that when we started off as a new nation, we weren't ready either. In fact, none of the Western powers who went through an independence movement had particularly smooth transitions afterwards, and they all seem to have figured it out eventually. And he argues here that this is totally fine. The inevitable result will be a government better suited to the people than any that our soldiers and their officers could ever give. So essentially, even a shaky government decided by the people will be better than the police state that they're living in now. Now, Carnegie isn't necessarily the most obvious person we'd think of as an anti-imperialist. I mean, in theory, he would actually benefit from the opening of markets for his goods, or at least the opening of new places for raw materials for his factories. But keep in mind that at this point, he's a bit older in age and essentially into retirement, and that kind of perspective changes people. And also, the reason he's against this is not just ideological in the sense that he's in favor of freedom and independence. The way that Carnegie perceives of the situation in the Philippines specifically, and imperialism more broadly, is that it isn't constitutional. He says that according to the Constitution, the federal government has every right to expand within the North American continent in order to absorb new states that were applying for statehood. But he says that the Constitution doesn't anywhere specifically authorize Congress or the president to go around annexing islands. And as a businessman whose business is heavily impacted by federal law, one can understand how Carnegie would be particularly bothered by the federal government starting down a slippery slope of doing things that are beyond their authority. That's not to say that the ideological things he's writing about here are just a cover up for his business interests, not by any means. There's no reason to think that Carnegie wasn't totally sincere about his desire to protect the sanctity of American idealism, especially in a country that had been really very good to him. In fact, despite being a solid supporter of Republican politics and therefore pro-business politics for most of his life, Carnegie considered officially supporting fellow anti-imperialist and Democrat William Jennings Bryan in his run for president in 1900. Instead, he just chose not to vote at all. But we can't divorce the complexity of Carnegie and the many facets of who he was from his decision-making here. Here again, in the official platform of the Anti-Imperialist League, we see a harkening back to the American Revolutionary era. In the second sentence here, it says that the U.S. federal government's reaction to Emilio Aguinaldo and his nationalist government is attempting to extinguish the spirit of 1776 in those islands. This is referring to the spirit of the American Revolution, the spirit of independence. A few sentences later, they condemn the extension of American sovereignty by Spanish methods, meaning that the United States has essentially just replaced the Spanish as the colonial oppressor here and not done anything better. And in the next sentence, they call the Philippine-American War a war against liberty. One of the more famous cartoons from the time period that captures a lot of the arguments of the Anti-Imperialist League is this one. The eagle here, which represents the United States, if you couldn't also tell from the flag, is standing atop the United States like a bird would stand on a nest. It has its left wing curled up over Cuba and Puerto Rico, almost like a bird would do if it was trying to protect eggs or baby birds, and then the right wing is stretched out to try to also protect the Philippines. The problem is that in order to protect all of them, the bird has to stretch super far, a position that it probably can't hold forever. So the message here is that it's totally going to make sense for the bird, the U.S., to have Cuba and Puerto Rico as attachments to the United States, as protectorates or colonies. They're close by and easy to get to. But in order for the U.S. to have the Philippines as a colony, we'd have to stretch our resources all the way across the Pacific Ocean, which is a lot of work and a lot of money. And eventually that will probably cause some problems, exactly like it did for Spain. And so the argument here is that we should let the Philippines go, not just for their sake, but for ours. Now, while all of this is happening, we're still fighting a war in the Philippines. We don't just stop that while we figure out what to do. And the war that we're fighting includes instances on the part of the U.S. troops of what today are considered war crimes. In 1901, a retaliatory attack on a U.S. camp led by Filipino troops after U.S. forces burned their homes and food supplies led to an investigation by U.S. troops under the command of Major Edwin Glenn. Glenn's men resorted to using what became known as the water cure, an early form of waterboarding, which is described here on the screen. This torture used against Filipino troops did lead ultimately to Glenn's termination in the military, but when that ultimately happened, Roosevelt's remarks were very telling. He noted, quote, "It is deeply to be regretted that he should have so acted in this instance as to interfere with his further usefulness," end quote. So Roosevelt isn't upset that Glenn tortured people. He's upset that he acted in a way that got him dismissed. And so now Glenn, who Roosevelt seems to think is an otherwise fine officer, can't be used in any other military capacity. This kind of mentality of abuse against colonized people, or at least black and brown communities across the globe, wasn't uncommon for the time, especially in these positions of power and especially in military traditions. 5 years later, after the official end of the war in the Philippines, we see another horrific massacre against the Filipino people. In the southern third of the Philippines was the Moroland, which were sort of less populated islands that weren't Catholic like the rest of the Philippines, since Spain had always had a hard time gaining control over them when they were in charge. So these islands tended to be Muslim and practiced polygamy and slavery and carried weapons like swords all the time. So obviously when the US takes over as a colonial oppressor from Spain, there's going to be a bit of a problem here. Not only does the US have a problem with their Muslim faith, but we, at least in theory, take issue with them having slavery as well, since we got rid of slavery in the US like 40 years before that. The first person to be in charge of this area was John Pershing, who we'll talk about later with World War I. Knowing more or less what he was up against, Pershing tried to take a more tolerant approach to the Moro people. When his successor, John Leonard Wood, took over, he dramatically changed course. In a sort of law and order style, he had a strong line view of anti-slavery and put down a new tax that he thought would put the Moro people in line. This turned out to be a bad idea. It led to a fight where the Moro people fled up to the crater of the dormant volcano that their island is known for, Bud Dajo, and fought for 4 days. Now, calling this a fight might be a bit generous, actually. Really, it was more like the Moro people falling like dominoes under the U.S. Army's machine gun fire, which they couldn't match with their own weapons. According to official reports, they lost about 600 people, but in reality, the numbers approximated by U.S. troops put it at closer to about 1,000. In reporting on the massacre, Mark Twain's criticism underscores both the immensity of the loss and the hypocrisy that anti-imperialists saw in the claims of spreading Christianity and democracy, while using the same troops to murder people based on things like religion and the right to bear arms, freedoms that Americans hold freely at home. He wrote, quote, "The enemy numbered 600, including women and children, and we abolished them utterly, leaving not even a baby alive to cry for its dead mother. This is incomparably the greatest victory that was ever achieved by the Christian soldiers of the United States." Back on the other side of the Pacific, the federal government was also dealing with the question of what to do with Puerto Rico, which they'd also acquired from Spain as part of the Treaty of Paris. What wasn't a question here was that Puerto Rico was a territory of the United States. Unlike Cuba, it didn't maintain its independence. What was a question was what kind of territory. In the United States, there are 2 types, incorporated and unincorporated. Incorporated territories are essentially territories that we anticipate becoming states eventually. These are like all of those territories that used to exist in the western frontier that we assumed would reach statehood eventually and be annexed into the U.S. Places like California, Kansas, the Louisiana Purchase Territory, and so on. This would also come to include places like Hawaii and Alaska. These places all have the same protections as people under the Constitution. An unincorporated territory is still a place where people are American citizens, but they have no representation in Congress. They aren't able to vote for president, and unlike people in incorporated territories, their citizenship is considered dynamic and can be taken away at any point. This distinction of unincorporated territories was actually created because of the Spanish-American War. Guam, the Philippines, and Puerto Rico all became unincorporated territories. This started with the case Downs versus Bidwell in 1901, which argued that because these islands were primarily inhabited by what the court called, quote, alien races, it would be impossible for the United States to incorporate them into their law and customs because like they'd done with other territories in the past. So essentially, even though the United States has decided to take over their country because they're not white enough, they don't get the full protection of the invading country's legal systems. And this isn't the first time we've seen this. This is literally the exact same concept that drove Native Americans beyond the boundaries of the United States borders and into what the federal government called Indian country in the mid-19th century. It's the same logic that dictated that Chinese and Japanese and other Asian immigrants didn't qualify as white, and therefore didn't qualify for citizenship because their customs were so foreign that they couldn't possibly ever assimilate. And it's the same logic that the federal government will use 40 years from this point to round up Japanese immigrants and their citizen children, in total 120,000 people, and put them into concentration camps. But here, the idea that racial difference makes up a group so different from white Americanness as to make them unqualified for legal protection creates a legal hierarchy within American imperialism. And this has lasting effects even still today as we watch Puerto Rico get pummeled year after year with hurricanes and consider repeatedly whether Puerto Rico might want to vote on joining the United States as a state. In the relatively immediate aftermath of this decision, one of the effects was that agricultural scientists, bureaucrats, researchers, and doctors flooded to Puerto Rico to both take advantage of new opportunities there, but also to see where their skill set might be of use to the people of Puerto Rico. It's worth noting that the vast majority of people who went there, either to live or for short research excursions, very likely did so with good intentions. After all, the crowded living conditions and sanitation issues that many people in Puerto Rico were experiencing weren't that much different than problems that those living in urban environments in the continental United States had to find solutions to only years before. But one example of medical malpractice is worth pointing out because of how egregious it was and how long-lasting the effects were. Dr. Cornelius Rhoads was working on the island with patients and drafted a letter back to his friend in the mainland United States, which you can see here, which he just left sitting on his desk, presumably to mail out later. One of his lab assistants found the letter and sent it to Puerto Rican nationalist leader Pedro Campos. This was obviously a huge deal because if you look at the letter, after he spends the first few sentences saying racist things about Puerto Ricans and Italians, he goes on to say that he wishes that a tidal wave would come in and kill them all. And then in the next bit admits that he himself has done his part by killing 8 patients and trying to kill more by purposefully giving them cancer. Rhoads is brought back to the mainland U.S. from Puerto Rico and put under investigation, where they uncover another letter that's worse than this one, although it wasn't released by the government. Instead of being stripped of his medical license, all of this is dismissed once he's brought back to the U.S., and he's set up with extra funding to continue doing chemical experiments with cancer patients. He's on the cover of Time magazine here because today he's known as the inventor of chemotherapy. But the fact that the U.S. government did absolutely nothing about his probable murder of at least 8 Puerto Rican people irreparably damaged the relationship between the people of Puerto Rico and American doctors. This relationship will become even more strained as the federal government, pharmaceutical companies, and doctors push untested birth control measures on Puerto Rican women from the 1930s to 1970s, giving the island the highest sterilization rate in the world. This suspicion of the U.S. federal government by the 1930s was probably most obvious in Ponce, Puerto Rico. In 1898, the city was described as delirious with enthusiasm for the United States. In 1937, the same city was the site of a nationalist march to show the United States that the people of Puerto Rico wanted self-government. After all, if it was fine for Cuba, why couldn't it be fine for Puerto Rico? During the peaceful march, American police officers opened fire, killing 19 Puerto Ricans and wounding nearly 200 others. To this day, it's the bloodiest police shooting in U.S. history. The trajectory of Hawaii was very different from that of Puerto Rico. White people from the United States had been colonizing the Hawaiian Islands since roughly the 1820s, when missionaries from the Second Great Awakening went to Christianize the Hawaiian people. And then they also lived alongside and sometimes were Hawaiian sugar planters. So when Hawaii comes into the equation in 1898, it's not the federal government's first interaction here. The Hawaiian Islands are ruled at this point by Queen Liliuokalani and other members of the Hawaiian royal family before her. Here you can see a picture of her on the left. In the 1890s, Queen Liliuokalani is working on a campaign of Hawaii for Hawaiians, so essentially trying to more or less run the super rude white people out of her islands, because they're honestly really pushy and trying to kill the soil and take more and more land and exploiting people, and it's just overall getting to be really hostile, which means obviously that the white people on these islands hate her because she's cutting in on their livelihood, and we can see this in the way that she's portrayed. Now, I want to pause and point out for a second the way that she's choosing to portray herself in this photo here on the left, because I'm willing to bet that this woman, as beautiful as she is not hanging out on the beaches of her humid islands in that satin dress. Like, that's not functional. I mean, that's a great looking dress and she looks amazing in it, but I wouldn't want to wear that in Texas, much less the humidity of the Hawaiian Islands. So there's a reason she's choosing to put on this dress for this photo. She wants to present herself in a certain way, in the way that uppity white people won't expect her to look, in a way that will demand their respect and will force them to see her on the same terms of respectability that they would see a white woman. This is a power play. But regardless of this, they refuse to view her in this light. Even when she goes out of her way to show that anyone can toss on white people clothes and play the respectability game, they refuse to see her in that way. In caricatures of her, white cartoonists portray her like the way that we see on the right. If you look at her face, she has bulging eyes and very pronounced lips, almost like you would see in caricatures of Sambo or Jim Crow. It's a sign of immense disrespect. So here's what happens in Hawaii. In 1849, the United States made the islands a protectorate because white people were growing a ton of sugar, and that's worth a ton of money. This means that the U.S. doesn't own the islands, but they were going to go out and use the Navy to protect them if they needed to. Then in 1875, we enter into a treaty that doesn't matter too much, that essentially is good for white Hawaiian sugar planters because it tells them that we'll buy their sugar. Yay for them. Then in 1890, that year rolls around and things turn super bad super fast in Hawaii. So in 1890, we pass the McKinley Tariff, which opens the US to certain types of overseas sugar while protecting very specific types of sugarcane and sugar production happening in like Louisiana. What you need to know from this is that it's bad for Hawaiian sugar planters. This is all part of, if you recall from our Gilded Age lectures, the whole deal about Republicans being all on board for tariffs. So this is where this coincides with other global events. So this tariff starts to put a strain on our white people in Hawaii who are now losing out on money. Then in comes the Panic of 1893, which if you recall was like the worst economic depression until the Great Depression in the 30s. And so overlap that with Queen Liliuokalani being all like Hawaii for Hawaiians, and the white people are really pissed. So being the white people that they are naturally, the businessmen overthrow the queen and take over the islands themselves. And then this dude here with the beard, Sanford Dole, proclaims that he is now in charge of the Republic of Hawaii. And so he stays in charge of that until 1898 when the United States annexes Hawaii as an incorporated territory. One of the reasons Hawaii is so important, other than sugar, is that it serves as a refueling station, which the United States finds useful because we very much would like to become a major trading partner in Asia, specifically China. At this point, the US is showing up a little late to what's essentially the division of China into what are called spheres of influence. This means that certain countries have areas of China where they're economically more dominant and have advantages over others. And so in 1899, Secretary of State John Hay sends out what are called the open door notes to all of these countries and tell them that one, each of them needs to make sure that they have at least one port that's open to trade for others in their spheres, and two, that only the Chinese government should be allowed to collect trade taxes within their country. After all, it is their country. Now, none of the countries he sends this to actually replied, but Hay took their silence as an acknowledgement that this was all cool. And so we can see in our cartoon here on the left that he's pretty confident that they would comply with this, because if not, the US threatened to use the Navy to uphold it. And now that we defeated the Spanish Empire in the Spanish-American War and had territories with supplies in Hawaii and the Philippines and a variety of other islands along the Pacific Ocean, that wasn't necessarily an empty threat anymore. For their part, China is pretty much okay with a lot of this. For starters, they're getting the benefit of being able to play all of the different countries off each other when it comes to trade. They also get the benefit of being able to tax them. So economically, for the Chinese government at least, this is not a bad idea. Where this becomes a problem is really more culturally. If you look at our cartoon here, you have this influx of goods from all over the place, and there's a lot of these goods. And let's be honest, these are not necessarily going to be super great, because the best quality goods from these countries naturally are going to be sold at home. And so now you have all of these sort of second-rate goods being sold into Chinese markets by Westerners. And this starts to disrupt Chinese cultural traditions and water down Chinese markets with inferior Western stuff. And so what this leads to is things like the Boxer Rebellion in 1900. Now, that particular event springs from a lot of complicated background stuff, but in a broader sense, it's a reaction to Western influence in China. And so when this rebellion takes place, it's a reaction not only to Western businesses, but to Western culture in general, Western politicians, markets, and missionaries. It's a way for the Chinese to reclaim their own culture in the wake of this inundation of foreign things. Japan is very similar in terms of desiring access to markets and balancing a delicate political situation with this. Dialing things way back to 1854, we have the opening of Japanese markets to U.S. trade. There is an incredibly lengthy backstory to this that we don't necessarily have time to dive into in our U.S. survey course, but which you hopefully learned in a world history course at some point. But what we have here is the Japanese government choosing to open its borders to outsiders for really the first time in something like 2 centuries. At this point, they're essentially in a feudal state with really traditional farming and strict social hierarchies. After this, though, there's a massive change in government and modernization of their infrastructure. I mean, if you think about it, Japan goes from a society of essentially almost entirely farming to bombing the Navy base at Pearl Harbor in less than 100 years. But anyway, fast forward to 1908. At this point, there's massive discrimination against Japanese immigrants in the United States. Not that this should be surprising to us. After the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882, Japanese immigrants, for the most part, replaced the Chinese immigrants as what white Westerners called the yellow peril. And so when it comes to discriminatory practices, they were the new targets. And specifically here, what we're dealing with is that in the city of San Francisco, Japanese children were being placed into segregated non-white schools. And this was massively insulting to a lot of Japanese immigrants, and they wrote home to the Japanese government about it, who also found it very insulting. Now, as a sidebar, I need to point out that a lot of these Japanese immigrants would have liked very much to be naturalized citizens of the United States, but federal law prevented them from doing so because it didn't consider them white. Their children, however, were citizens of the United States because they were born here, and that's how the 14th Amendment works. Some of these early children, though, were also considered citizens of Japan because their parents would send their names back to be logged in the census records of the Japanese government. So as far as the Japanese government is concerned, these are also their people. Although the extent to which this is actually legal citizenship is a bit questionable, as well as how long this went on and the exact number of these that occurred. So anyway, we've got a problem here where the Japanese government is pissed at the US about the discrimination against their people, and it's not just the schools, that's just an obvious case. So they sit down with the US and hash out an agreement called the Gentleman's Agreement, where the US agrees to stop the discrimination, or at least do their square best, and Japan will stop issuing passports to low-wage workers, meaning farmers, so that white people on the West Coast will stop complaining about immigrants stealing their jobs. Win-win, in theory. In addition to this, they agree to what's called the Root Takahira Agreement, which says that Japan will agree to respect open door policy in China, and in exchange, the US will let them annex Korea, or at least we won't stand in their way. This doesn't seem like a huge deal right now, but will become a huge deal later that we call the Korean War. And finally, back on the other side of the ocean, we're certainly getting our miles in during this lecture, there's Panama, which technically before this lecture does not exist as a country. So hopefully we're all aware that Panama is home to the Panama Canal. That's like their thing. But before Panama, it was actually Colombia. What had happened was, since the dawn of forever, everyone knew that the fastest way to create a man-made route to the west, other than going around South America, would be through what's called the Isthmus of Panama. That's what you see here on the map. This is essentially the shortest or narrowest point from A to B that people would have to dig out dirt in order to get from ocean to ocean. And this exists in what's now called Panama. And when Teddy Roosevelt, who's president at this point, approaches the Colombian government about the United States doing this project, they say, no thanks. And he's like, oh, rude. Now, at this point, there's a group of Panamanian nationalists, or rebels, I suppose, if you want to call them that, who are fighting against the Colombian government for sovereignty. And so Roosevelt, more or less, this is very much a summary, goes to them and is like, hey, if you were your own country, would you let us dig a canal here? And they're like, sure. So he asked them if they would hypothetically do this, and they're like, yeah. And he's like, okay, what would you hypothetically need in order to be successful in fighting your venture? And they say, like, money and weapons. And Roosevelt is like, oh my gosh, we have both of those things. And so we essentially, but kind of unofficially, help the Panamanians with their revolt. And then when they win, they let us build the canal. But that was the easy part. See, we weren't the first ones to actually do this. We were taking over this project after the French tried and failed to do this the first time around. And the reason that they gave up was because of disease. Too many of their people died. Because if you've ever been to Panama, which just taking a wild guess that most of us haven't, it's a rainforest. So there's mosquitoes everywhere. If we know anything about mosquitoes, it's that they carry diseases like malaria and yellow fever. So step one was to keep our people from dying. Cue scientific racism. One of the things that doctors insisted over and over was that African Americans were more resilient to things like yellow fever and malaria than white people. And this was simply not true. The entire idea was based on the idea that people living in Africa tended to die less from mosquito-borne illnesses, but those were tolerances built up over time after generations of families living with those diseases. And even then, people in African countries still die all the time from those diseases because they are massively deadly. but doctors and scientists insisted that Black Americans, because of their genetic ties to the African continent, must be resilient to these diseases. So they sent them off to Central and South America as ahead teams to drain the swamps for white people. And as a result, about 4,500 of Black workers died versus 350 white workers. In 1909, Teddy Roosevelt had this to say about the extinguishing of entire populations by white colonizers. Mere savages whose type of life was so primitive as to be absolutely incompatible with the existence of civilization inevitably died out from the regions across which their sparse bands occasionally fitted, when these regions became filled with a dense population. They died out when they were kindly treated as quickly as when they were badly treated, for the simple reason that they were so little advanced that the conditions of life necessary to their existence were incompatible with any form of higher and better existence. He gave this speech at the expansion of the white races at a Methodist church in Washington, D.C. during a celebration of the African Diamond Jubilee, an effort to raise money on the part of missionaries to Africa. The remainder of Roosevelt's speech is praiseworthy of not just American efforts to imperialize the planet, but the remainder of the Western world, especially those in Africa, where the United States only had a faint presence at this point. And his justification here for the extermination of Black and brown populations across the planet, mere savages as he dismisses them, is that even when the supposedly civilized nations of the world tried to be kind to them, they were simply not smart enough to survive. The type of language employed here and the meaning it carries is significant not only for the progressive era, but for foreign policy moving forward. The idea of colonized people as savages or as people of lesser than status carries on into latter parts of the progressive era and into Wilson's thinking during World War I. And as we'll see, ideas born out of the First World War ultimately carry into the Second and set the foundations for organizations like the United Nations that still exist today.